Okay, so my name is Alastair Irvine. I'm here to do a presentation about some software I wrote called Toolbelt, which intends to deal with some of the bugbears I've discovered about the installation of software on Linux and other Unix-like systems. So let's get into it. Right, so I call Toolbelt a middle orchestration tool because it kind of sits somewhere in the middle between extracting things out of a tarball or using a full-scale provisioning tool like Ansible or Chef or something like that. Now, Toolbelt is cross-platform. You can install this on theoretically any Unix-compatible system, and with some caveats, it should be able to install software as long as that software is available for that platform. So I'll start with a little bit of background on what is Unix. In my rough definition of Unix is any operating system that provides the uname command. So when run without options, uname gives you the name of the system you're running on. If you run it on Linux, it will say Linux. If you run it on a BSD variant, it will give you, say, FreeBSD, for example. It also has other options that can give you things like the release of the kernel that you're using, the version, I should say. Uname, though, is a pretty standard Linux and Unix tool. It won't give you information about the Linux distro you're running if you're on Linux. So what you then have to do is further checking to find out information about the distro and what release of the distro you're running. And there are other ways to do this, like there's files you can check in / etc. And there's also an lsb_release command that, if present, is very useful and has options that can tell you things like the release and the code name with or without helpful labels as to the data it's showing you. So for scripts, you run it with the -- short option and it just gives you the data. But that's an exercise for the reader to look into that tool. It's often not installed though, so there's a package for each OS that allows you to have that LSB release tool. But my script doesn't rely on it. So Linux distributions and packages. When you've got a Linux distro, the fundamental way software is built for that platform is all of the software is built and then a given Linux distribution release is created. When you install it, you don't get all the software that was built for that release, but you can install any piece of software that was built. And every time you install something, you'll get the version of that software that was built for that release. Now, I'm not talking about rolling release distros here like Gen 2, and I'm pretty sure CentOS version 8 has gone to rolling release. But with the more traditional style of Linux distros, you're running a given release of the distro and you install a package, you'll always get the same version corresponding to that release. So the way Linux distros do package security is important because you want to make sure that you're always installing the legitimate version of whatever software was created and built for your release. And public key cryptography is a good way of doing this. For example, Debian and Ubuntu, which is based on Debian, have a bunch of public keys, as in GPG-style keys and PGP, installed when you actually install the OS off the installation media, or you get a VPS in the cloud. Every time you install a package, it actually checks the package file, like a .deb, against the key it's installed in the OS, and it means the package is always valid and says, yep, this is the same binary file that was uploaded to the archives by the package maintainers. I already mentioned about the package versions being locked to the distro release. You're not always going to have the exact same piece of software because it may include security fixes. However, that doesn't change the version of the software, as in if they're backporting a security fix to the present version, the only code that gets changed in the OS version of that software that they had to make the security change for. But typically they won't change the version of the software other than to add a special extension to the version, which is to the distro, which says which patch level. Okay, that's better. Sorry, the microphone was a bit quiet. Now you can actually set up most distros to automatically install security fixes, but that's a judgment call as to whether or not you do that. So before we get into discussion of Toolbelt, I'll talk about what happens if you don't have a piece of software at the version you require available in the Linux distro package archives. Then things get interesting, because there's no standard recommendations for how to get software and install it in a secure way. You really just have to do whatever is recommended by the vendor in order to install the software you want. We're assuming we're talking about open source software here. So one of the ways you could do it is they could send you the software and a file that contains the MD5 signatures of all of the bits of software, and a signature file that is a cryptographic hash over signatures file. And so you use a multi-stage process, which I won't read out because that's up there on the screen, to verify that that binary that you've downloaded is the correct one. Nevertheless, this sort of thing is exactly why I wrote Toolbelt, because I wanted to automate all of the fiddly little steps as well as make sure that you're ensuring security. A bit like how when you're SSHing into a server for the first time, it's considered good practice to check the host public key fingerprints against a known external source. Because if you don't do that, the first time you connect to the server, there's a man-in-the-middle attack in progress. Next time it warns you that the host keys have changed, it probably means the man-in-the-middle attack went away in the meantime. So when I'm talking about third-party package archives, what that refers to is package archive, where you download binaries in the format that's typical of the operating system's own package archive, which really they just install the same way that the OS packaged software does, only where it comes from is the different part. So under Ubuntu, that would be known as a PPA, private package archive. And there's a little bit of extra tooling in Ubuntu to ensure that you automatically verify the download of the keys. But with Debian, what you can do is add a file to etc apt sources.list.d, and this is where you put information about how the OS can find additional packages other than the ones that it came with. And then you also have to install a special public key to, in fact, mean that those packages can be verified, because you're going to by definition, they're going to be having signatures in the package files that differ from those used by the keys to sign the official OS packages. But once you've got that all set up, it works the same way as installing an OS package, and you could do something like apt install Kubernetes and it would just work. So the objective in Toolbelt is to not just have to Google how to install something, because there's been attacks published where people have put up stuff on how-to sites that have turned out to have bad data in them that can, it's equivalent to malware. Like, you run the command by copy pasting, but it also runs some extra stuff and it owns your box. So the Toolbelt principles, I spoke about complexity level before. Toolbelt is designed that you don't have to do anything else to ensure security when you're installing software that's supported by Toolbelt. For example, there's a bunch of asterisks in those subpoints there, which means that if any of those verification methods that Toolbelt can use to verify the software you're installing, it will automatically have the first starting piece of the puzzle on how to verify that software. Right? Because anything that Toolbelt can install has a copy of the maintainer's public key, for instance. So without dwelling on verification methods, I'm going to talk about entities. An entity is something you can install with Toolbelt. I'll give you an example later of what entities are currently supported, but just keep in mind that if you want to install something with Toolbelt and it's a standalone piece of software, you can think of that as an entity. I'll get to other things Toolbelt is intended to do in the future, a bit later on in the presentation. But for now, we're just going to focus on the entities side of things. One of the advantages of Toolbelt is that it doesn't just know how to install various bits of software, it also knows about all of their dependencies. And this can include things like particular programming language support package, which is available through the OS. It can install it, and then it installs the software itself. So you don't have to worry about getting your computer ready to install the software. Toolbelt knows everything you need and how to find it. And when I said cross-platform before, I mean to say that if you've got two different ways of installing Java, depending on what Linux distro you're using, and your package needs Java, entity I should say, then it will install Java in the relevant way for the platform itself. And we'll see more details about that when I do the partial code walkthrough for Toolbelt later. Any questions so far on the principles or objectives of Toolbelt? Nope, then let's proceed. Okay, I do want to go back a little bit and talk about risks and trade-offs though, because Toolbelt's not a panacea. You won't automatically get completely secure software just because you installed something with Toolbelt. See, the installation process might be secure, but then what if a security bug is found in that software down the track? You're not safe, okay? So that's why I put this slide in here to talk about the things you have to consider when deciding how to use software, where to use it. So the OS package versions, they're often out of date because depending on the distro, it can be 6 months or a year and a half between when you get your next OS release. And if you need a newer version of the software that is installed in the latest stable release of the OS, you have to resort to either using some sort of beta version of your OS, or you need to get the software from somewhere else. The advantage for using software that's in the latest stable Linux distro release is that it has automated security updates, which is not to be sneezed at, okay? Now the reason why most of them, unless they're a rolling release distro, have all of those fixed versions of your software is because they build them all together and they know they're all going to work together, right? And it also means that your dependency versions won't change. You know that if there's libraries that you need to run software that you're installing on a server manually, you know what those library versions are, and they're not going to change until your distro itself is upgraded. It's not like you get a different version of, say, someone want to pick a library that's commonly used on a C project. Yeah, Boost. Let's go with Boost. You'll always know if you're on a given release of a given Linux distro, you'll get the same version of Boost every time you install it. So it's predictable, right? So that's when you're talking about developing software, it helps you target stable dependencies. Now it is considered important to upgrade your distro whenever there's a new stable release coming out. And usually that process is really smooth because they do a lot of work in testing to ensure that release upgrades go smoothly. However, it's not always practical to update your OS as soon as a new release comes out. So you might, for practical considerations, be using an older release of Linux. There is a way around that, right? You don't necessarily have to update your full release if you can use a thing called backports. I'm not going to describe them in detail, but briefly, this is where the OS themselves provide the equivalent of a third-party package archive, where if you set up your OS to use backports, you'll suddenly be getting a newer version of whichever pieces of software are in the backports package archive than you were if you were to just install the standard version of that package from the OS. Now, importantly, these backports are either built against the dependencies present in the OS itself, or they supply newer versions of the dependencies. And this can cause some conflicts, but usually that's all worked out because backports are typically supported by the distro vendor themselves. But backports aren't a panacea, and very, very few things end up in backports repos, which is why you can't always rely on those either. I spoke before about third-party package archives. You're kind of trusting the vendor of the software who's maintaining this archive as to whether or not they give you any security releases or security patches. You may get new versions of software that you're not expecting, because unlike the OS package archive itself, you do get new versions of software uploaded into this package archive, because they're generally a little more laissez-faire with how the versioning of their software happens compared to how OS vendors do it. And something to look at in case you are using backports or a third-party package archive. I know Debian and therefore Ubuntu supports this, but I don't know about any other OS distros, is a thing called package pinning, which can make sure that you don't get a surprise major version upgrade on your software. Exercise for the viewer. If you don't have backports or a third-party package archive, it's the Wild West. Like, you don't know how you're going to find out about security updates to software. You have to basically somehow know about that from a mailing list or whatever, and then go and manually install software when there's a new version with security fix. So it's really important to understand these trade-offs and make the call that's right for the situation you're in, because there's no one ideal solution for installing software. Any questions on risks and trade-offs? Oh. Okay, so here's an example of running Toolbelt. So as you can see at the $ prompt up there, I'm running Toolbelt space list-entities. And that will show all of the entities that the current version of Toolbelt is capable of installing. So there's a couple of lines that have wrapped a little bit. But for the most part, the first column contains the name of the entity. So it supports things like the Amazon Web Services command line interface, a tool called AWS Vault, which is not provided by Amazon, that's just off someone's GitHub repo. There's a tool called Boring, which I'll talk about later. Composer. Composer is an incredibly important thing for PHP web development, because Composer is how you can install extra PHP dependencies into your project. It's incredibly useful. It can update itself. It will warn you if there's a new version available, which can say, okay, you have to get it to re-update itself. But how you install it in the first place is you go to the manufacturer's website and you look up the installation instructions, which involves Googling and copying and pasting, which is a pain. So this, I think, was one of the first things I got Toolbelt to install. You just type Toolbelt install Composer, and it installs it for you. And it sets the permissions, and it makes sure the command is installed with the right name, and it puts it in user local bin. So everything works as you would expect. And then you can just run Composer. Jenkins, PowerShell, Mina, which is a kind of an interesting descendant of Capistrano, which is not just useful for Ruby. I've given whole talks about Mina before, but yeah, it's great for deploying stuff over SSH, which is a different use case to Ansible, for instance. Steam, I got Toolbelt to be able to install Steam, or at least the Steam launcher, and manually updates itself. It even does Terraform, and there's this really awesome thing that I'll tell you about in case you haven't heard about it. WordPress administration can be a bit of a pain, especially if you don't actually have a login for the admin panel on WordPress and you need to administer it. So if you cd into the document root of the WordPress website that you want to maintain, and you run the WP command, it's a bit like, if anyone ever remembers Trac, T-R-A-C, which is an integrated wiki and issue tracking system, that had a really cool command line admin tool, and WP is kind of patterned off that. It lets you create users, put the site into maintenance mode, and do all sorts of admin type stuff from the command line. So that's really good for when you're a dedicated WordPress admin, or you work for a hosting company or something. Okay, so what we're going to do now is look at what happens when you run an installation of an entity, right? So go to the next page, and this is what happens when you install boring. Anything with an asterisk or two at the start of the line is put there by Toolbelt because it tries to give you feedback on the process, not just show you the output of the things that it runs. It says it's installing boring, that's entity name. You can install multiple entities on the one command line, and it will say installing single quotes as it iterates through the loop. And all the way down at the bottom, it's got asterisk done. It shows you after the installation of the entity of all of the entities, if all of the installations were successful. If anything goes wrong during the process, it will bomb out straight away, and it won't install anything else. It kind of assumes that it's sort of like a fail-safe mode in that case. All right, so then you've got the double asterisk. The double asterisk indicates a step in the installation of a given entity, and it tells you what command it's running, right? So in this case, it says it's installing the Ruby gems package because it knows that boring has a dependency, which is Ruby, right? And so it installs it. So the square bracket ellipses things are where I've had to chop out some of the output to make it fit on one slide. And as you can see, it's decided to install a whole bunch of packages, more than those because they had to eliminate some of those as well. And then blah, 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 it sets up the Ruby language because it wasn't installed on that server already. And then having finished installing the dependency, it now installs the tools. So you can see it's got two asterisks and then running gem install boring. That's the command it runs to actually install the boring program. And then it gets the gem, installs it, installs the documentation, one gem installed, and then asterisk done. So that's exactly the sort of thing that Toolbelt does for you, is you tell it to install something, and it just does. In any case anyone's champing at the bit to know what boring actually does, it takes text input that's got ANSI escape codes in them and strips it out and just gives you plain ASCII with no escape sequences. Very useful tool. Very hard to install because Ruby's a pain, unless you've got Toolbelt. Has anybody got any questions so far? Here's how you install Toolbelt. The process of installing it is a bit messier than actually using it to install stuff. This is a bootstrapping problem. And so there's a bootstrapping subdirectory in the GitHub repo, and I'll actually show you the GitHub URL at the end of the talk. So you can either do a remote installation by using an Ansible playbook, or you can clone the GitHub repo onto your server and run bootstrap/install.sh, which I'm pretty sure will work. I made some fixes to it today. So what happens when you install Toolbelt is it puts the binary in user local bin, it puts all its other stuff in user local share Toolbelt, and it creates a directory that it uses for storing mutable data that it needs to keep around, right? Which goes in varlib Toolbelt. Now, just a caveat, if you're on Red Hat or one of its derived distributions, don't try typing sudo Toolbelt and expect it to work because it won't. The path that sudo uses on Red Hat does not include user local bin and user local sbin. Presumably, that's a security decision that distro made. And I'm not going to criticize them for it. I'm just going to say that if you want to run Toolbelt on those distros, you either have to use the full path, which is on the third bullet point there, or you can use the ln command to make a symbolic link in user bin, which points to user local bin Toolbelt. And then you can just type sudo Toolbelt in that case. Everything Toolbelt itself needs is in the GitHub repo. It's got no dependencies, basically. I mean, it kind of does. It assumes you've got like GPGV and OpenSSL installed. That's something I should probably do is check for dependencies during installation. But, you know, most of the stuff it's got is considered mandatory packages on most Linux distros anyway. Well, most of its dependencies are almost always going to be on whatever Linux distro you're using. It doesn't even rely on that LSB release command that I said is not often present. It really gets down and checks the files and etc. to figure out what's going on with the release. Right, so I am going to ask a question. Who wants the partial code walkthrough first, and who wants the live demo of extending Toolbelt to be able to install something it can't currently do? I want to take a poll on the live demo first. Hands up. Poll on walkthrough first. The notes, that's one, so, or two. I think I'll do the live demo first then, because that's kind of what we're looking at. Okay, can you please cut the camera feed and just switch to slides if we can? Oh, wait, if I'm doing a live demo, that's not even going through a big blue button, and so we'll need to, like... well, yeah, can you do that into big blue button, can you? Oh, yeah, all right. Oh, I really do want that one. Yep. Well, I'm going to sit in front of my laptop and do the demo. Make the text speak. Okay. More? Yes, I'll try. Yep, I see it. Okay, so this looks like it might even work. Right, now the first thing I'm going to do is into a VPS, and I'm going to probably manually update a already installed version of Toolbelt. So that's in user share. This is local. Yeah, really do it like this. That's the mic, so it's actually audible. Okay, testing. Good audio. Okay, so there's two different ways that Toolbelt understands what it can involve, right? So it's got a file called entities.sh, which has a whole bunch of information all smushed together. I'm not going to show you that one because that's too complicated, but it also has the ability to have the information for a given entity contained within a given file. So I'll show you the one for Terraform. What we have is there's several bash arrays that are manipulated by this command. Commands array, because as you can see, it's got the word Terraform here. And it runs a whole bunch of commands, which won't make much sense, so I'll just do a summary. First of all, it's going to set the variable so it knows what version of Terraform is available to install. And it is going to predetermine what URL it's going to install that version from. And it's going to figure out variables are going to be what location does it derive the signature for the hash file from, and also where does it get the hash file from. There's multiple levels of verification required here. Then it's going to use an internal command called fetch, which just uses wget or curl depending on what's installed, and loads a bunch of files to a specific directory. So sign script_tempdir. The reason why there's a bunch of backslashes here is because there's some Toolbelt variables that you want to expand at entity definition time, and there's other ones that you want to expand at entity installation time. So anything with a backslash that gets evaluated later. So then, after we've downloaded this signature file, which contains the 256 sums of the files that are needed to install Terraform, it uses an internal command called pgp-verify. Was this signatures file signed with the developer's public key? Comparing it against the signature. It's comparing the checksums file against the PGP ASCII armored signature over that particular file. And as I hinted at earlier, Toolbelt has the public key that signature file is verified against, which is used to check the integrity of the checksums file. And finally, it runs a second fetch command, which is on line 7, sorry. And this actually downloads a particular zip file containing a particular release of Terraform. Then it does a SHA-256 check against that zip file, knowing that the checksum URL, or in this case, the file name derived from the URL, because it's using a bash trick to chop everything except the file name of the URL. It's using that to make sure that the zip file is legit. It knows the checksum file is valid because it checked it using a PGP signature, a key that was built into Terraform. Finally, on line 9, we can actually see that we're unzipping the zip file downloaded. Everything else prior to that was figuring out what the latest version is and making sure the files were valid. Not assuming anything about the validity of anything that it downloads. It literally checks the public key that's built into Terraform. That's all the complex stuff. Everything else is easy. The straplines array says that Terraform is a high-level cloud provisioning tool. When you run the list entities subcommand in Terraform, in Toolbelt, sorry, that will show you all of the straplines. And if the straplines array doesn't have an element for a given tool, you'll just get the name of the tool with no description. Because you might recall that there were some things like AWS-Vault, and they didn't have a strapline as the name of the entity. That's because this element in the array of straplines wasn't set for that particular. And then there's a description, because if you type Toolbelt, it'll tell you what the subcommands are, and one of them is info. And so this whole string here that spans like 9 lines or something, the information that will be shown on standard output when you run Toolbelt info Terraform. And lastly, there is a dependencies array, which we're not actually setting the element for Terraform because it has no dependencies, surprise, surprise. But if we did, we'd have dependencies Terraform equals, and then other things, which I'll talk about in the walkthrough. That could be other entities, or it could be OS stuff that it depends on. But this message, normally all you'll get is the asterisk done to show that the whole Toolbelt command is finished running. If the messages array element for the entity is set, it will show you a given message after it has successfully installed the entity. And this can do things like, say, directory a given piece of web software was unpacked into, so you know where to point your Apache. Lastly, there's the option for aliases. Like, remember I was talking about the WP CLI command? That, if I'm doing demos on a dark background, is there a light switch we can use to turn these front lights off? The bottom one, if you can. Okay, great. That's probably better. Yeah, so if you install WP-CLI and it doesn't work, it's because you should have used the WP and vice versa. So aliases just let or work when you're installing. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to a template file and attempt to do all this stuff for Sandstorm. We'll see if yep. We'll find out because we will find out what Sandstorm is when I go to the website and figure out how to install it. But first, I'm going to create a bulletin entities file for Sandstorm. And I'm going to edit it. Need to do to copy my template anyway, because it looks like I installed Toolbelt as myself into this server. Here we have empty versions of everything, so I'm just going to do a global replace. Know how to install it first, so I'll just do the browser probably won't show up in the presentation, but this is where I'm going to go to sandstorm.io, which I know to be the website for this project, and try to sandstorm.io. So under Get Sandstorm, we'll see the community or open source version. Session instructions is so I can hopefully trust these installations. Do you still have the terminal sharing on the video? Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm just on the Sandstorm website here. I'm off on the video now, has it? Right, so we've got a curl bash command for Sandstorm. Now I'm going to paste that into the commands in the entity file. Ordinarily, I would do this properly and actually download the file, check that it downloaded okay, hopefully verify the file that was downloaded against some kind of key, but for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to do that yet. What I will do though is in a description. Hash strings can have multiple lines, which is useful to know. I check that page to see if it had any dependencies that it needs to install. Also don't really want any dynamic DNS set up. What we're going to do instead is download the install script. I want to see if I can give it some options to not set up any dynamic DNS stuff. All of this stuff where it's talking about downloading the release keyring, verifying certificates. This is all of the stuff Toolbelt can do internally with all of its verify functions. I'm not going to try and install from source. Looks like this one's a bit heavyweight, but I'm going to try running it anyway. Await the dependencies and the aliases and the messages. See if I can not Toolbelt info. It shows you the strap line when it, like it would in the list entities command, subcommand, and it also shows you the rest of the description. So now we're going to try installing it. What happens? It's listening for inbound email on port 30025, which is vaguely concerning, but I'm not worried because I have got firewalls protecting this server. And it's offering to run it on port 6080, which I'll do, and then I'll use port forwarding later to actually redirect into this port. It looks like somebody grabbed my preferred username. Okay, I'm just going to try and guess something else that I want to use instead. No, this is one that hardly ever anybody gets. Anybody knows what that means, you get a free brownie point. Without Google. So that's halfway downloaded already. While that's doing its thing, I'll talk about the process. So ideally, Toolbelt wants to make things easy. So you'll notice that install.sh file that was downloaded and then run by the curl bash sequence that the website told me, I want to try and avoid that because it asked a bunch of questions that I feel I didn't really need to know the answer to. For instance, I automatically want it to choose to run on port 6080. I automatically want it to say this is not a development installation of Sandstorm. I want to install something in the way that's most commonly going to be used, right? which means what's known as an opinionated installation. Opinionated simply means that the person who's installing the software for you has a bunch of opinions about how it should be installed and has picked a set of common defaults, which is what Sandstorm would be installed by when you use Toolbelt to install it, because it's going to predict the most common use case and do that. It looks like there's some kind of problem connecting to a socket that's set up by software. It looks like the installation didn't exactly succeed, but it looks like it wasn't a complete failure either. As you can see, because it was a partial failure, it has dropped out back to the command line without giving the asterisk and the done statement. And now I'll see what error code it gave me. Yeah, so something that went wrong in that installation process dropped the error code of 1. And because Toolbelt is designed with bash failsafe principles in mind, it just drops you out and gives you the same error code as the last thing that failed. So if anybody got any questions about the process of extending Toolbelt, because if not, I'll go through the partial walkthrough and just spend about 2 or 3 minutes showing you some of the more important bits of code that it uses to do its work. Nope. Okay. What we're going to do is a number of include files shipped with Toolbelt. One is verify.sh. So that goes from the very simple, PEM verify, where you've got a text-based PGP public key, which is typically a .pem file that's shipped with Toolbelt, because $libdir is a Toolbelt directory, and one of the things in there is installer keys. As you can see, $entity.pem is the key that's pre-shipped with Toolbelt for whichever entity uses the pem_verify command during its installation command. I won't go into too much detail about what this pem verify function does, but it just uses OpenSSL to cryptographically verify a digest against a given the public key. Then there's something which does a basic digest verification. That's where if you want to check, make sure that the SHA-384 digest, for example, matches, and you've already got the digest file, or you've downloaded it and verified it some other way, and use the digest verify function. There's a different thing where if doing some PGP verification and you've got a ASCII armored public key installed along with Toolbelt, one of the Toolbelt setup steps, which happens as part of the Toolbelt installation, is it makes a GPG trusted keys keyring in the Toolbelt var directory and imports all of the ASCII public keys into that trusted keyring, because GPG can't verify against individual keys, it verifies against a keyring containing multiple keys that are imported into it and are considered trusted. So yeah, if anything Toolbelt verifying against a key that's already been imported into a keyring earlier. So if I look at context.sh, this is where it sets a bunch of environment variables that are used internally to know, for example, what operating system type you're running on. We'll come up with the word distro, which the variable distro, which says which distro, like Ubuntu. And it can also do smart things like if the distro comes up as Linux Mint, it just goes, oh yeah, that's close enough to Ubuntu, and just fudges it to Ubuntu. It's also got fallback methods to read the files if the lsb_release command wasn't present. In this case, it is going to read Debian version. Skipping forwards there. All of this is there's BSD and macOS type stuff as well. The whole point of this file is it ends up with a couple of environment variables set that the entities.sh file, which contains all of the things that don't or that can be installed that aren't in their own individual entities file. All of those can check these distro environment variables and do things in a platform-specific way. That's how Toolbelt achieves its nature. So I'm going to talk briefly about how some of the dependencies work. Talk through the whole entities file. Entities Toolbelt can install this. You'll notice that there's some aliases, right? So is putting an element in the aliases array means it's defining an alias, and when you install that alias, it will actually install what the value is on the right-hand side of the equals sign. Interestingly, there's one of the ways dependencies can be defined. Uses the disk. Because when you want to install gem, that's an alias that actually equals the distro name and then a colon and then Ruby gems, and does second level alias verification. And it goes and goes, okay, how do I install Debian colon Ruby gems? When you've got a distro name at the start, it actually goes, okay, well, anything that starts with something in a colon after it's fully resolved through multiple levels of alias expansion, I know to install that as an OS package. Because anything that doesn't have that colon in it is considered a Toolbelt entity rather than an OS package. So that's how you kind of have two things existing in the same notional namespace by having a prefix on there for if it's an actual distro package, not just some other Toolbelt entity. And as you can see, some settings in there that are used for Toolbelt, but there's a whole bunch of case statements down the bottom that do all the platform-specific stuff for certbots, so I won't try and describe them in any more detail. So that's pretty much all I wanted to cover in the walkthrough. What I think I'm going to do now is go back to the presentation. So, yeah, like, now you know that dependencies can mean multiple things. Yeah, so as you can see, AWS CLI has a dependency on pip. Vary depending on what distro you are. So down here, if you're running on Debian, it sets an alias for pip to refer to Debian :python3-pip. And that alias will be defined differently on a different distro. So that's how it deals with the fact that on some distros, you want something, it's got a different package name on a different distro. So yeah, this file's got over 200 lines of spaghetti code in it like that. I won't show you the code that does the walkthrough for the dependency and alias resolution with the recursiveness that is implied in it. If anyone wants to look at the GitHub repo to see how that works, there's the URL will be at the end. Yes. How do I turn off screen sharing? Is it this thing up here? Yeah, I can't actually reach it. The mouse cursor won't go up there. Okay. Right, I'm on the other screen and it still won't reach it. Oh, I know. I'm on the other screen. Okay. Yep, to turn off screen sharing. Done. Missed it. Let's try that again. Oh, there's several.
I'm actually on.
Let's just go on with the presentation then. Thanks for your comment though. It's actually, I hadn't heard of Big Blue Button before Plug started using it. And yeah, it seems to work pretty well, and it's open source, of course. Okay, so future features of Toolbelt. When I designed this thing, I was kind of thinking a bit bigger than just being able to install software. And so I have this idea that if you want to create some kind of web project, Toolbelt should know about all of the common like web frameworks, both front-end and back-end. Because I don't know if you've heard of a project called Create React App. This will give you a directory with a bare bones React application in it, because React is a JavaScript framework. There's also a thing for creating a PHP project called Composer Create Project. And that will actually give you something like, say, a Laravel project that's using an existing GitHub repo as a template. If anyone's heard of a project called Cookie Cutter, that uses a similar method of downloading a GitHub repo and using the contents as a template and prompting you for information, and it gives you a project that's customized for your needs. And so I want Toolbelt to be able to do that, right? So what it would hopefully be able to do is run a number of different commands to assemble one project out of several different projects that have like a front end and a back end component. So that's what I call a project. It's something that didn't exist previously, and you're creating it from templates. There's another notion of a component. So a component can kind of mean two things. It's either something that is part of your software, which really is more like a module, and you want to add a new controller to a web project because you're making a new page that represents things like a bus ticket, okay? So your project might handle like booking travel, and you want to add a bus ticket module to this project. So that would involve a controller, and you'd have like a whole thing of the URL for bus tickets points to this controller, and that controller is what adds, removes, and shows bus tickets. But in Laravel, you would use the artisan command with the make:\controller subcommand, and it gives you a new controller. You've got to give it a name as well. And it's a way of adding things to a web project without just having to copy paste something you've already done or go looking on the web. So this principle I want to be able to incorporate into Toolbelt and do things like, oh, you want user authentication in your project, I'll give that to you. And it just drops in the relevant files into your pre-existing web project. And it will have already figured out whether it's a Django project or a Laravel project or a Cake project or a Node project, and just give you what you want without you having to go, oh, I'm using Node and I want to set up user authentication. How do I do that? The other kind of component is a third-party component. For example, if you have a PHP project and you want to do database migrations, what they are is out of scope for this topic, and you decide to use Finks for that, you can type composer require Rob Morgan /Finks, and it will give you migrations. It just basically adds a new dependency using composer. So I'm like, well, what if I had an opinionated PHP project and I always wanted that to have migrations? Finks could be part of the creation of that project. Or I could just have a Toolbelt component called migrations. And if I say Toolbelt add migrations, it figures out whether I'm in a Django project and it says migrations already present, here's how you run them. Or if it was a PHP project, it would say, okay, I'm installing Finks for you, here you go, here's the command to run. And if you're in a Python project, and you want to install some dependencies, you would ordinarily use something like pipenv, but there's no reason you couldn't, say, have a collection of dependencies called, Python CLI, and so when I add the Python CLI component using Toolbelt, it could install all of these packages from PyPI that represent all of what I need when I'm going to do a command line project in Python. So again, opinionated, but that's what it's supposed to do, is it doesn't want you to have to do a whole bunch of setup steps every time you start a new project. There's also this other idea I had of a thing called a writer. For example, when you install Terraform, it's installing that from a public package or something, but you might want to automatically install your own Terraform config whenever you install Terraform on a new server. So Toolbelt will do, when I'm installing this piece of software, automatically run this writer that the user has configured, so the software then gets configured to the user's standards. And that could, for example, when I was back there talking about Sandstorm, how it was asking me a bunch of questions I couldn't be bothered answering during installation, I could set up a writer that answers all those questions for me. And then the way that would work is there'd be a config file. Toolbelt would read the config file, which contains the writers for Sandstorm, and it would then modify the command it uses to install Sandstorm, indicate run the install.sh command with these options because that's what the user wants. That you're obviously having to make your own entity that's like Sandstorm underscore mine, because that would just be messy. And there's the one last thing I want Toolbelt to be able to do, which is generate an Ansible playbook for installing an entity. Now that's going to be a bit weird, right? Because I've already got a bunch of functions I use like pgp_verify and fetch. In theory, I could make a bunch more functions that are generic, which means when I'm running Toolbelt on the server, it runs the function that does the thing on the server. When I'm outputting an Ansible playbook, instead of calling the function that does the Toolbelt thing, would instead go, okay, when I'm doing a PHP verification, this is the bit of Ansible code I generate for that step. And so then it would become more of a code generator than a sysadmin tool. But yeah, that's probably like version 4 or something. Okay, so probably better wrap up because time's getting on. Right, so in summary, if software is not packaged by your OS vendor, or you need a newer version of what they've packaged and you really know you need it, then use Toolbelt. But if you can get away with not using Toolbelt, it's probably a better idea. Like if you can set up backports, then that's a good way to get newer versions of software. Still hopefully have security patches, which will more closely mirror the way the software is set up, and that software makes it into the main line of the distro when the distro has its next stable release. Another tactic to use is if you're deploying onto a slightly older production server and you're running into the problem of, oh, when I install Node on my workstation, it gets the newest version of Node because that's uses the dependencies that my workstation has. I'm going to flip it and go, instead of upgrading the production server to match my desktop, I can install a development VM or something a little less heavyweight, if anyone's heard of schrute, but it's a Debian thing that you use when you don't need privilege separation, but you do want to run a different operating system user environment under the same kernel as what you're running on your actual computer. You're then making a development environment that mimics production. And then whenever you install and test things in dev, you know they're going to work in prod because you're using the same OS release. But lastly, upgrade your OS release unless you have to stick with the old one. Okay, now I'm going to go to questions, and there's the URLs I was talking about before. There's a microphone if anybody wants to ask questions. That way the question goes onto the video.
Obviously a labour of love there, Alastair. How long have you been working on Toolbelt?
Pretty sure I started at prototype about 1.5 years ago when I was having to install certbot, which is the Let's Encrypt command line front end. And I had to do it differently depending on which release of Ubuntu I was installing it on. So originally Toolbelt was basically just a case statement, and then I added the aliases feature and then the circular, the nested dependency resolution. And then I had to add all the context stuff because all of that context stuff actually came out of my dot files. And so I sort of repackaged that into Toolbelt so Toolbelt would work for people other than me. And eventually I'm like, okay, well, let's actually give Toolbelt the ability to list what entities it knows about. And so then it will crawl through the commands array and get all the elements and then list them for you. And if they have a strapline, it will show the strapline. So yeah, I've just been adding features and features and features onto it to make it into something that I could actually publish to Git and not be embarrassed by. So there, if anyone wants to use Toolbelt, it's functional. It can install all of the pieces of software that were in that list entities subcommand, with the proviso that I generally use Debian or Ubuntu. So if you're using CentOS or Amazon Linux or something, you're probably shit out of luck for most of the entities because I probably haven't done the platform-specific stuff for them yet for other operating systems.
Does Toolbelt have a way of updating itself, or do you just need to bootstrap it again if two versions of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. You should just rerun the bootstrap install playbook. It'll work. Ansible or the install script should be idempotent, as in you can run it multiple times without it breaking, hopefully. Oh, okay. Well, if you don't want to, you don't have to. Okay, go on.
Okay, fine. Can you install Toolbelt with Toolbelt?
I had not actually thought of that, and I can't think of a use case why you would, so no. Although maybe one day Toolbelt can generate its own Ansible playbook rather than me having to hand code it. Thank you.
What was OAQS?
Oh, right. Well, there's a thing in an E&M Banks novel which talks about various divisions within Contact that aren't special circumstances. He's sort of retroactively added new chunks to elements of the culture, which is culture with a capital C. It's kind of a civilization in this science fiction series. And one of the sections within Contact, they talk about contacting civilizations that have sublimed and removed their need for physical matter. So ships that are in this particular section will often start putting OAQS on the end of their name, which stands for On Active Quietudinal Service. Yeah, so it's a really unlikely combination of letters that I'm never going to forget, so that's why I chose it. No. No, I have other websites, but that is not one of them. All right, is there any serious questions? Because if not, we better wrap up. Thank you all for your time.